we've got about 3 hours worth of content to move into.
I always, well, I mean, you asked me to tackle this behemoth of a topic that has so many thousands of years of history behind it. I mean, if you trace back the history of language alone, you are going back eons, right? And so when you're like, I want you to talk about theory, I was like, oh boy, this is a big one. And I really sort of struggled, right, to organize my thinking. And whenever I submit a paper to a professional journal, I always get feedback from the editors. You need to organize better. You need to, compartmentalize things. But for me, it's so hard to separate these things because they are so intertwined and so connected. To separate language and literacy from the act, the actual physical kinesthetic act of reading, right? It's very hard to separate. And so, anyway, I hope that you guys are able to follow all of the sort of rabbit holes that I'm going under and planning to go through today. So I want to start out by talking first about old theory. And I thought, what better image to bring forward with old theory than the good old Pat the Bunny, right? It is by far one of my children's favorite books to read from when they were little, partially because there's that tactile that Kate was talking about last night, right? They can feel things, they can lift things, they can interact with it. And so in my brain, the way I conceptualize print in books, apps are a jumping board off of this sort of book format, this book genre, right? Because they did this already with board books for children. They've lifted the flaps, and Kate talked a lot about that last night. But this is my daughter Anne when she was 2 years, I think, 5 months. And she was reading Pat the Bunny with me on screen. For her, and for everybody that's sitting here, language is really important. We use it to communicate, but we also now use other ways to communicate with visuals and with music to create mood. But all of the ways that we build meaning serve a social goal. They serve to entertain, they serve to inform, right? And so there's a purpose behind the print and the language that we're using. And I don't think I'm presenting anything new here. And Warren told me last night, he goes, you're supposed to be Warren talk. Right? Oh. And I was like, thanks, Warren.
That's what he told me.
He did? Wow. Warren, I thought I was getting some special insight. But so literacy, and for a child to use language is this socially normalized act, right? And so there's a lot of pressure. They have desire to learn new things, to tell stories. And so it's important. It is a tool that we use to create meaning in social contexts. This image is front and center in my dissertation study, and I studied preschoolers' comprehension of interactive storybooks. A lot of times when we are talking about apps and creating meaning with text, we forget that text is only one part of it. The reader brings with him or her a whole wealth of things that you cannot account for and predict very well in design. And so there's that whole aspect. And then you add into that how teachers, how librarians, how parents are going to construct an activity around that and what the social capital of that text might be. It is a really complicated thing that designers are trying to undertake. Calculating and projecting, it's a lot like Moneyball. Like, what are they going to do with this thing that I've created, right? So you're trying to play a predicting game of how will my audience, so the range from 2 to 6 years, what do I know about them? What do I know about how teachers are going to use it? And what can I build in the text that is going to hold some social capital so that my thing that I build will get used in meaningful ways for young children to help them learn language and become literate. The other thing that I want to encourage you all to think about is another model. We like models in academia. This is called the model for domain learning, which for most people in the early ed category, they fall in this acclimation category. We learn knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, because we have high situational interest. Something grabs our attention and we follow it, right? Think about a kid walking down a sidewalk. Squirrel passes in front of them. What do? Squirrel. Squirrel, they follow it, right? High situational interest, right? As you become more mature and your depth of background knowledge sort of develops, you build individual interest. And so there's this interaction, right? You are looking for high situational interest, and that can be built from the text, it can be built from the activity, it can be built from the individual, something that grabs his or her eye. And so I think that this idea of how can we sort of balance those two things along a sliding developmental trajectory is really important to consider as well. When we talk about literacy, there's also this notion of what are we talking about? What are the different slices of skills that we need to know about? Bill Teal presented, when did he present? Last year or the year before?
I think it was the year before.
I'm not plagiarizing. I emailed him and asked him for the build, and it was actually published in a piece that we co-wrote. So I feel pretty comfortable using it. But what we did is we mapped out the different domains of skill that develop. And in the literacy world, we think of two different kinds of skills. There are skills that are constrained and skills that are unconstrained. Constrained skills are ones that develop relatively quickly, and they're fairly easy to measure, to determine, to assess what children know about them. Unconstrained skills, on the other hand, have longer, less steep trajectories of growth, and they really never continue. So that's that part of where in order to become skilled in an unconstrained area, you have to have that individual interest of that graph that I was talking about. So articulation, do you guys know what that is? How children pronounce words, right? So early on, children start to qualify for speech and language, 2 to 5, 2 to 7, depending on what you're looking for, right? And so that has a steep, quick trajectory of growth. Syntax is the word order of a sentence. Every language has a syntactical structure, right? And children learn that very quickly. By age 2, by age 3, they are putting together 2 or 3 word sentences, constructing sentences with proper syntactical orders. And across languages, no matter what language you look at, this is happening fairly quickly early on in life. They also develop something called phonological awareness, which is knowledge about sounds and how they work in spoken language. Phonological awareness is something that does not require eyes. It is all purely auditory. They also focus on letter recognition, and this is very common in preschool and in kindergarten. When you move and you learn a new language, if it's a new script, you have to relearn that over later on in your life. And so you can move any of these sort of along the line depending at what point of entry you have, right? Like if I was to go learn Mandarin Chinese, that's a new script. So I would have to learn it. And I bet you if I moved that down, because I'm so far in my life and the neural pathways in my brain have already been formed, I have to rebuild those, right? So there's a neurological component behind this, and so it changes the slope of your line if you move the point of initiation and development, right? Because your brain structures are primed for learning in the early years, right? There's also this idea of decoding, which builds on what children know about phonological awareness and letter recognition, and so it's only natural that that comes after. Now, here is where you start to notice a change in the slope of the line, right? So word recognition is something that sort of falls out initially with decoding, but it goes beyond that, and it's a slower process as you get up into more complex words that you start to see around 10, 11 years of age, where children start to explore etymologies and word origins and roots and that kind of thing. Spelling follows a similar, those lines are very correlated. They fall out very closely together because they're reciprocal processes, right? We learn more about how to spell by decoding more words. They complement one another. This line, though, is very interesting because vocabulary intersects with so many of those domains of development, those language and literacy skills. Vocabulary cuts across them all. And vocabulary never peaks. We're always learning new words.
What's that little blip?
What blip?
Is it like baby talk?
This?
Yeah.
That's just, I think, build. Cut the build. We're not designers, we're literacy people. PowerPoint. It's a PowerPoint mishap. And notice here, reading comprehension is at the bottom of the barrel. Our reading comprehension is really something that is underdeveloped comparatively speaking to all of these other skills because it is dependent on all of these other skills. All these other skills have to happen or you get no reading comprehension. It's just not possible, right? And so keep this chart in mind. We'll come back to it. Oh, and it's really easy to talk. Another bit of context, right? So the National Reading Panel and Reading First came out, and we built this graph slightly after that. And so it was interesting as we were building this. We were talking about it, and we're like, oh, we forgot composition because writing wasn't part of the National Reading Panel because they didn't find any research studies that said this is an effective thing to teach in terms of language and literacy. And so it was sort of an afterthought, but the trajectory is not related to that, but I often feel like in the discussion of language and literacy, the composition process comes last. And so it's kind of apropos that it's last on this graph. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that those skills are analog skills. They are skills that we learned in a print paper environment, right? What we know about how those skills develop surely translate into a screen-based context. And so I think it's important to recall what we've already learned, know our history, and think about that as we move forward. When you change from paper to screen, you also change the skills that are required of the children, right? So when we talk about print directionality in a paper-based text, it's always left to right, it's always top to bottom, unless you have the surprises with the page that Kate sort of showed us last night, right? But in text, in depending on whether you're reading in a Kindle or a standalone ebook app, you could be encountering what's called reflowable text, right? Where you might have a static image and they change the font size and the image that helps support that comprehension is no longer on the same page. That causes a bit of a conundrum when you're thinking about how do I support a child in building understanding. The other thing that's interesting is scrolling is a bit of a figuring out process for children. When you hand them a book, they pretty much always know I turn the pages. But when you hand them an iPad, the search for how do I figure out how to it's very obvious the first time that they encounter a new text that they have to figure out how does this thing move and what do I do with it. In terms of and that sort of segs into the whole navigation process. Things in the web-based world, at least, are incredibly hyperlinked. I've yet to see really, when you go to like Goldie and Bear in the map, that's a hyperlinking, right? But I've yet to see, TouchPress does it in some of their older age nonfiction books where they have the hyperlinks embedded. But for really young kids, I haven't really seen very much hyperlinking. And I think that there's some room for that because that's a really important research skill and a comprehension skill, right? Children lose their way in terms of the path that they're following and the narrative. And so if they have hyperlink, there's room for teachers to talk about how do we navigate and how do we get back to that main idea when they might get lost. I hope people are following where I'm going with that because it's sort of abstract. The other thing that adults do in a digital world is we search and we use a menu to find information. I can't think off the top of my head of a young children's book that has a search feature that's not part of a Kindle or an iBook? Could anyone think of
Well,
one?
I mean, in a way, actually,
Those visual menus and bookmarks.
the one where you were doing that,
Woo-woo.
woo-woo, is in a way actually about creating a visual menu, isn't it? I mean, it's
Yeah.
about, oddly, eat my words now, it does what that does.
Yeah.
That does something, I can think of that, that's
Yeah.
an example.
Yeah.
And actually the Janosch in a way, I guess, had a sort of, but that's more menu, isn't it? It's not really
Right, but it's
sound.
not a search with results and I pick
not a
my,
search with
and I
results.
pick which one. So it's not strategic in the same sense that searching as we would as an adult to find what we're looking for would happen and play out.
So the visual bookmarks that a lot of the books use, where you touch the ribbon, and then you see the scenes that you've already seen, that is a search, a non-verbal search, to visual search.
Right.
So I think that might be the fit, but you're right, there's not like a
Okay.
find every time the word dog's here.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear from the teachers what they think about hyperlinks for very small kids. Because it sounds like a risky thing. Like as a developer, it sounds like a risky thing to put into a project. Because they would lose themselves. Like you end up going places that you don't know exactly where, and how do you go back?
What are you more talking about within the app?
Within the app.
Yeah, it links you from one back and forth.
And Katie was talking about, and did say, this is something that might work for older children. You won't.
No,
But
no,
no,
so
what
say the opposite
I'm
of AE.
thinking about is we, at about 4th grade, right? We have to teach children how to navigate hyperlinked text online. Is there a way that we can build that in to what children are experiencing from a younger age in a developmentally appropriate way? I'm not suggesting, and I think perhaps part of that would become, if you think about that circles diagram that I had, part of that might become the teachers talking about and using the term hyperlink, maybe in Kate's app where she has that, so that they're learning what those literary pieces are.
I would think that like the Tiny Bop apps have hyperlinks,
Right.
right? So if you see something on the screen in Tiny Bop that you can click on it and it'll pop up with something new that gives you more information about it. That,
Yes, it expands that one thing. That's
Right.
brilliant. The Tiny Bot ones sort of do that, I suppose. They're visual
Correct.
hyperlink.
But in practice, how many teachers think
Well,
really
I was just
use
gonna say,
that?
I just, honestly, last week, now, of course, my 42-year-old brain can't remember what I did it with, but I did just the other day say to my kids, this is a hyperlink when you click on it, because we have smart boards, so we are doing things through our computers.
Yeah.
So I did just do, I think we do a lot of things. Yes, it's like those teachable moments that pop up, and so I literally did just do that, so I think it's doable. It just
I
depends on
think
the
it
context.
is doable, and I think that as a group of people who work and build things and study children, that there's room to sort of be more intentional about how these more developed sort of adult literacies
And as long as it's done in a safe,
happen.
developmentally
Yes,
appropriate
exactly.
way, that's the key piece.
How can we build that back? Because if you think about how you teach grammar, right? You start with nouns and verbs, and then you build into sentence combination and tenses and subject-verb agreement. And so there's this developmental curricular build, right? And for me, I feel like there's a lot of room for that in the early grades curriculum.
Do you think, Katie, that when, like in the apps, I was gonna demo one, maybe I won't. Where you touch the word and the word is spoken for you, that is a hyperlink in the sense that you are linking to the audio of that word. And we see that a lot in some really good apps. In some cases, the word also gets highlighted or colored in. I think that's a good example of something you can do with very young
Absolutely.
children, and it is a hyperlink in a sense.
Yeah.
That I think really can support them.
So I've already talked a little bit about like in the different ways that we construct meaning. And that was obviously a copy paste from a Google image and didn't expand very well, but this is fantastic, where children can actually manipulate the soundtrack behind the things that they write. There are such incredibly powerful conversations that can happen when you give children that the authorship of scoring a soundtrack to the app, because then they can manipulate the mood and weigh the contrasts, right? And how does that change and auditory input impact the trajectory of the narrative. And so I've already sort of talked about this idea of digitally literate, and Darren sort of alluded to it. But I was reading the other day an article about how the use of emojis is like a new language. And you know, in the comments, somebody's commenting, wouldn't it be great to write a book just based on emojis? And I'm thinking to myself, no, it doesn't sound very interesting to me, but...
Maybe written in emojis.
Exactly, exactly. But that whole idea of emoji and memes and all of these like cultural relics that we have, right, is that there's social interaction for the purpose of meaning making, right? And so there's clout with these new forms of language. There's a lot of statistical research about use of ebooks and whether parents use them or not that demonstrate that ebooks have a lot less clout than I think a lot of people in this room think they should have. And I think that that's part of the challenge that we're facing, is that there's this misunderstanding about what these media are and how we ought to use them and what children think of them. And so I think that's part of the struggle that we're facing in this field.
One question, one thing I love about those trajectories is they let you see how complicated and messy the language acquisition process is in a child. It's developmental, and every day that goes by, what you do with them, their environment, can determine what trajectory those things, where they end up. I tried to get my mom, who's in her middle 80s, to use an iPad. I've tried everything, and one of the things I noticed is her first reaction was she would jab really hard, right?
Yeah.
And she doesn't have that skill
The
set.
press typewriter.
And a toddler would do the same thing. When they first come into a touchscreen, the harder you push, and this is sensory motor, the harder you push, the more you get. And then they start to learn the swipe. And the swipe is definitely a developmental landmark.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering if that might be the next project, is to take those growth trajectories and...
Jackie Marsh in the UK has sort of started to look at the trajectories of that. The Dubbit report that David Kleeman just worked on sort of has some of those developmental milestones as reported by parents. So it's not, there's a difference between what parents are reporting and actually hard observations.
And we, in my book, which is on that table, we divided, as we wrote it for parents, but we started with slappers, and then tappers, and pointers and tappers, and so we have our own, we made it up, but it's based on our experience in development and working with kids, and we use that to help parents understand.
And you're talking about those
the
like
actions.
stages of motor control.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly,
So that
as
we
they're
can-
related to the screen interface.
So that we
and
can
they
say to a parent.
impact what the child understands about the story is what I argue in the next few
And
slides here.
Slimers.
They do.
Slimers, yeah.
So there's this vacuum of clout, I want to call it, in a lot of places. And librarians and teachers are doing excellent work in bringing credibility to the act of reading on screen. And so hats off to you all that are actually using these media in meaningful ways with children. I think it's important work that needs to continue, because I believe wholeheartedly that the skills that they learn from interacting with interactive storybooks and ebooks on screen, on that sliding scale that Warren created from super interactive to less interactive, that those skills will build and emerge into the mature digitally literate in one way or another. And I don't think that there's enough developmental research there yet to validate that claim, but I wholeheartedly, with every bone of my body, believe that these skills develop and these skills will translate. So an interesting thing is that this is from the Cooney Center work. They did a survey of parents' ebook reading habits, and this is a chart of parents who do not co-read ebooks with their children. So these are the naysayers. A lot of them worry that the child would want to use the e-reader all the time. So there's that whole overlay of what is the social dialogue around screen time and how do we understand what that means. And then there is this idea that reading with a child is difficult on an e-reader. And I think that that's a fallacy, to be honest with you.
I think that had a bunch to do in the, we also did 36, we also did a quick study of 36
Right.
families, and a lot of it had to do with the distractions, associated with enhanced books.
Well, yeah, and the distractions, I think, of the child sort of figuring out, what do I do with these things? If you look at 2-year-olds with board books, how do they manipulate them? What do they do with them? They put them in their mouths, they flip them around, they don't look at them from beginning to end. Developmentally, these are normative behaviors. It is absurd to think that a toddler, that a 3-year-old is going to sit down at an iPad nicely, with it on their lap, and not try to figure out. Children learn through play, right? Even with books, they learn through play. And so I think that there's this idea, largely held by society, that in certain slices of society, let me categorize it, that these devices should not be for play with young children. This is a reading device, and it needs to be a formalized adult-like reading experience.
Well, some of them also cost 60 times what a book
This
costs.
is true too.
Can I just say, from a purely practical point of view, because I'm an app developer, but I'm also a mother of young kids, and I read every night with my 6-year-old and have been doing since he was about 2 years old. And I have to confess, as a mother, I have never read an e-book with my children, because we develop games, okay, that are intended to be played after school and accompany what they're learning at school. But the reason why, I'll tell you the reason why, is because I work, which a lot of mothers work, at night, when I come home and I want to read with my kid, it's calm time before the kid goes off to sleep. And I'm worried that by looking at the screen, it's going to wake him up and stimulate him. He's had his screen time already. That's just from a purely practical point of view. My kids have had their screen time because they're allowed half an hour screen time after they've done their homework. They've had that, and it's after dinner, and it's quite what we call quiet time. It's from 7:30 till 8:30 till they go to bed, and we're reading books because I want their eyes to be calming down. I don't want them to be stimulated during that time, and that's the only problem I have with e-books, is because I'm worried that they will stimulate their mind, because the screen, as they are at the moment, they have to focus on the screen, and it's been shown, there are research studies to show that it stimulates the brain. And that's the only reason why I don't work with e-books. I'm happy for them to do it during the day, during their half hour of screen time. But unfortunately, my kids now, they want to play on Minecraft.
Well, and that half hour of screen time, another bunch of studies, I think by Julia Parrish-Morris, found that parents use that screen time option in the transition from work to home. Yeah. And so mom can't necessarily be sitting and co-reading an ebook, and so they let the child choose from a menu of options, and while they cook dinner, right? And so there is that hard reality of double working families nowadays, where that screen time fills that void, much like television did when I was a child. But the choices that they have, it's a competition, right?
It's back to that. So I'd quite like some of that half hour or hour, or however long the child has, to be reading reinforcement. I'm not at all saying that I'm expecting that a child will snuggle up necessarily in bed or kind of on in that bedside moment of the last book before bedtime. I'm not expecting that would be a digital book, but I'm quite interested in the idea of also actually about children who are unable. It's one of the reasons we give the audio support for children who are unable to decode the stories themselves, the picture books themselves, and they're maybe not familiar enough text for them to be able to replicate the story. This is something where they can have a story experience with text and illustrations that's a genuinely reading experience, quite independent of the parent. And I think there's something, I feel quite kind of, there's a tension there, but if they're going to be spending that time on screen, I quite like some of that time to be reading time.
Yeah, I have to say with my 6-year-old, when he was under 6, yes, I do, because we develop educational apps. So yes, of course, I'm always putting educational apps in front of him, and he's happy to do that during that half-hour screen time. But once they're beyond 6, to be honest, it's a lot more competition.
That's exactly why we say we stop where we do, and why it's challenging to create really compelling reading experiences for middle grade.
It is, because then you're in
Competition with a whole set of other things, with Minecraft, as you said.
Well, and I would guess that for some parents, it's the child knows how to use it better than I do. And they discard that they can tell or read a story better than an app can. And they don't see the co-activity and the snuggles and the stuff they remember maybe from their childhood translating to a new media. And I think that's one of the next, I think, places is this whole helping parents figure out what it looks like and feels like to do that, and that's part of what I'm working for, and I know there are many others around the table, but the work that you guys have published, there's small samples that they spend more time about don't touch this is how you turn the page, and less time on story.
Right.
It's just part of, we have to figure out what that looks like.
And there are several studies that validate that categorization of discourse around ebooks and the ratio of parent talk about control versus content and dialogic sort of expansion of plot and understanding. Did you?
Yeah.
I wanted to point out, and you guys, Michael and Lisa, have Komienza in Casa. They use
We'll
ebooks.
show a little something.
We'll show that.
on
And
that
so just as a sneak preview, they're going to show how. Do you have ebooks as part of that?
It blurs the line, right?
Yeah.
This is actually an app.
Okay.
It's
So
an apps experience.
using ebooks, and I've had many conversations with Bonnie Blagojevich, who does Komienza in Casa, which is in Maine, and they work with migrant families. She always is talking to me about ebooks and what is available, because the parents see it as a tool that's teaching them also the language. And the translation features that are in the ebooks are helping them learn how to talk to their children about what things that they're interested in English, which is incredibly powerful. And it's something that you don't really get very much in printed books because they're not readily available in bilingual format. And so I think that this issue of control is part of the, it's difficult to read with a child puzzle, right? That the parents have this, well, nope, that's not how you're going to do that, and let me do that, and wait, and they're holding back hands. And so I think that understanding perhaps a little bit of the cognitive processes that are behind those actions and understanding play as a form of natural development could help sort of change that narrative a little
I think
bit.
we're also just hearing one other piece of this. I'm forgetting your name.
My name is Katrina.
Katrina. A lot of it is not just cognitive, it's the emotional relationship building.
Right.
So much of it is about conjuring your own comfort zone, conjuring the kinds of relationships that you built around the cozy evening with your child. And designers need to begin to think about what is kinesthetic here.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure they are.
So here I have a video of, this is my Annie, and she's reading Nosy Crow. And this took place in the context of shared reading experience. So this is the third of our shared reading experiences. So she's developed quite a good understanding of what this is and what do I do with it.
This is her third shot at using this app.
Third shot at using this app.
That's a good way to do it. Now you can forward.
Alright, so this is about where I wanted to start.
Yeah, hard job, right? What about this one? What does he say?
This is exciting.
He's excited?
Why? This plant is heavy. This plant is heavy.
Is it easy to carry or is it hard to carry?
Ha!
Yeah, let's Let's turn the page and see what happens.
The first little pig soon found a piece of land.
And this is one of the things that she really struggled with, is this waiting for the narrative, right?
What are those things?
And I think that it's important
It's
that
not a
we
house
do it
yet,
that
is
way.
it? Let's
There's
help them
this
build the house.
cognitive processing of, oh, I have to wait. It is so hard for a little child to wait.
I know.
And
Are
what
those
you
bricks or
typically
is
see
that
happening,
straw?
and I have another slide that follows this, is this
What is
tapping,
that stuff
kind of
it
tapping. And if you let it go long enough,
Straw.
do you know what happens?
Who likes to eat
You go to
that?
that home button on the iPad, and they abandon the entire listening activity because they reach this point of cognitive frustration, right?
Right here.
Where,
Good straw again.
where they can no longer handle the weight.
But are they waiting, like in her head?
They want the action
You
to
think
move
she's-
forward.
Do you think she's waiting, or do you think she's failing?
I think it's a little bit of both.
'Cause I think it's
I
like-
don't think she understands the weight.
She doesn't understand the way.
She doesn't, despite the fact that I had told her in the first and the second reading, no, honey, you have to wait until you see the blue bubble. It won't work. You have to listen to the story first, right? And so this waiting, if you think about executive functioning in 2-year-olds, they don't have it, period. And so how do we blend that developmental reality into our design of apps is a really interesting question, right?
One thing that I suppose
Because over there, like, my impression that she was doing was like, swipe didn't work, swipe
Swipe
didn't
didn't
work,
work,
swipe didn't work, swipe
Swipe
didn't
didn't
work,
work.
swipe didn't, and that's why she would escalate.
Well, and then
I mean, it's again one of the reasons why you say, okay, we can only have really short chunks of text. And also, I would say that while Annie's obviously, massively
verbal,
book comfortable and very, very articulate, we never saw that as an app for a 2.5-year-old. We saw that as an app that was a kind of 4+ app, and we know that there are kids who are 8 who are using that, who probably do have that, a little bit more of that.
I have my son who's 4.5 that we're going to look at next.
It's just interesting to see. And you don't, but what do you do? Oh my God.
Yeah, I know, exactly. But I mean, if you think about board books, how many of you are kindergarten teachers that still have board books in your classroom library? First grade teachers that have board books?
Yeah.
So these media that are technically for toddlers and early preschoolers, they make their way up. 1, because they're favorites and kids know how to read them. 2, because the language in them is more accessible to the people who are learning language, right? And so I want you to look just at the processing, the actions that Annie had. So I categorized this as whether she was, and this is going to be submitted hopefully early June to a journal for publication, whether she was acting on a hotspot or a page turn, right? And this is the elapsed time into the storybook reading. And I counted the number of attempts that she had to activate that click. Right? And then I looked at, was her action successful or not successful? Did the whatever she was clicking, did it do what it was supposed to do? Right? And then I started to look at, well, how did I assist her, right? Because this is a social action, and little kids need help.
As she would with a book.
As she would with a book. And so what are the kinds of help that we can give these children? And so you want to sort of give them time, right, to see if they can come to a point in their own learning processes where they can do these things on their own. So I was like, all right, I'm going to give her 3 tries with no help. And then she got there, and so I said, I pointed to the arrow. I said, turn right there. Press there to turn. She's pointing in the wrong spot, and I could direct her to point in the correct spot to pay attention to the blue circle where the visual prompt is, because she's not attending to that, right? As you get farther
I also
down,
thought it was really interesting, can I just say that you used the words page. You talked about turning the page, and I thought that was really interesting that you're already importing for her a kind of metaphor, which actually isn't directly relevant. I mean, it does the same thing as turning a page, but it's not exactly turning a page. We struggle with this as well. How far you use these skeuomorphs, how far you abandon, how far you you know, how far you try and keep the vocabulary. It's the only vocabulary we have. As Darren said, we're like really early doors here. We only have the vocabulary we have.
And I think that there's some room for tweaking that language. Move along, let's advance, let's move forward, right? But not all narrative moves in a forwardly linear process, right? If you look at some of, I got for a while after my dissertation was done, I started reading Jodi Picoult books, which are adult fiction, detective fiction, narratives told from multiple voices with multiple points of entry into the plot line at different times in the linear equation. In a lot of ways, interactive ebooks operate in this way where you're manipulating the timeline. And so moving forward is not always necessarily the best way to describe that action. If you get anything from here, I want you to see that after a while, she stops attempting to move the action forward. And from my experience in studying engagement in printed classroom read-alouds, I know that when children get that point where they're checking out, that you either need to re-engage them or help them in some way, otherwise they're checked out and they're done. And they're not making any meaning anymore, right?
Do you think that those were moments when there was no attempt because she was listening? And was there any way to test that?
No, at one point, she says, you do it. And at another point, she just gets up and walks away from the e-reading experience, and I bring her back in.
I suppose, an interesting question would be, if you had given her a picture book a physical picture book that she's experienced 3 times only, and you gave that to her and asked her to navigate her way through that, how long would that experience have lasted? And would she actually still be there at 6 minutes 35 seconds? No. Still, but I think that, you know, it's kind of interesting to think, this is not great for me to see. It makes me feel sad inside, just so you all know.
But it's a 2-year-old.
And it's a 2-year-old. But I sort of think at least that was offering her some responsiveness in a way that actually a picture flat, a standard picture book, that's a hard thing to captivate a 2.5-year-old without very, very explicit parental engagement, without it always being, you do it. You talked about her saying, you do it, kind of at some point down the line. But actually with the picture book, it's all about you do it.
I guess the bigger question for me is, should we be designing things for 2.5-year-olds to play by themselves?
No.
One thing that I always think as a producer is that maybe it's not your fault. Maybe her kid is broken.
I never think that.
I'm saying that's her. The mother's always broken.
But I would say that for her, the only two apps that I would say, 3 apps that I would say we've done would be Pip and Posy Fun and Games. I'd say we've done Busy Bear, Fun on the Farm, and Busy Bear Builds a House. And those are deliberately much simpler for a 2.5-year-old to engage with. And in just the same way that I think about, you know, what books are appropriate to publish in board book form as an adult, and what books appropriate, what story is it appropriate to give in picture book form. Similarly, you're thinking about these.
So let me just say though, and remember when you go into schools, then you have 6 or 8 of these little bodies doing these things that they need this. So just start thinking bigger than that. If you're interested in being in schools, the layering is even greater because you only have 1 or 2 adults and you have 12 or 14.
I mean, if you think about if you go to a library, right? Yeah. There are sections that are intended for toddlers, but my toddler can walk over to the chapter books. My toddler can walk over to the adult, nonfiction, disciplinary books on quantum physics and pull down a behemoth of a volume and sit down and look at it. And I'll guarantee you a lot of those toddlers do, because they're learning about how these things are and how they work. Right, it's part of the emergent understandings of how these things work.
Also just learning the motor skills, like how to grade, turning a page. Like a lot of times when I introduce, I work as a therapist, but a lot of times when I introduce books, it's for trying to train in sustaining position or whatever. And a lot of times kids will just close the whole book and like they are done. And if I dig sometimes, and it's not always, but if you dig a little deeper sometimes, you'll find that, you know, their eyes are tired, they're having trouble going from left to right, they just can't sustain the posture anymore, the overall posture anymore, and they're fatigued.
A cognitive load kind of thing, where
Yeah.
the feedback, the biophysical feedback to their brain is interacting with their process for.
This is a
It's
really
all combined, it all goes together.
This is a really annoying diversion, but who knows the YouTube video Medieval Help Desk? Medieval Help Desk. So Medieval Help Desk is a really interesting, and we could maybe look at it because it's here. Medieval Help Desk is about a monk who's called in another monk from the monastery because they've just moved from scrolls to books, and he can't. He's kind of
I show that at the start of my
doing that because he can't work out how to do it, and we can look at it.
I believe that should be on tap for tonight.
It's hysterical.
It's very funny. It's Swedish, but it's got subtitles.
So just to contrast, this is Charlie. He's 2 years older, almost to the day.
And that's who I think we made that app for.
Also his third time with it. Now, I think it's important context that he did not want to have the narration read to him, and he did. So
Okay.
I don't know, that was part of the design of this study, was the third. So typically what you see in ebook studies is the first time either an adult is reading to them or the app is reading it to them. And then the second time it's sort of like a read and play, you explore on your own. And then the third time it's sort of you can choose. And so I was trying to replicate that methodology in this, and they chose different ones, which is a limitation of the design, right? So here's Charlie. What is he doing?
I don't know.
What is he doing with all that stuff?
He's throwing it.
Do you remember what that stuff is called?
Hey.
Right.
They could call it straw too.
Right, it's called hay or straw. And he's building a
House.
house, right. The bottom says, the first little pig soon found a piece of land and he quickly built himself a house made of straw. And so it's very clear that both children are constructing vocabulary and narrative understanding, and I would argue it's because of the multiple exposures. And all of the Israeli ebook studies and the Dutch ebook studies all confirm that multiple exposures are really critically important before you evaluate things. I did not do that in my dissertation design, and that's a significant limitation. And what I saw was a comprehension floor on all of my comprehension measures. And so I really wasn't able to talk about what they were understanding. But when you're working with 130 preschoolers in 3 centers and you're 8 months pregnant, it comes to a point where you're just like, I gotta get the data collected and get done. And so I regret that I didn't do the multiple exposures in my dissertation study, because it would have been interesting to see. But same sort of analysis with Charlie, what do you notice?
He wanted to do it by himself.
There was more independence.
A lot less clicks.
A lot fewer clicks if you're counting the number of attempts to activate.
A much greater success.
And greater success rate, right?
You're feeling better now.
Yeah, I feel a bit better.
So,
but that is really interesting, because when I think about who it's for, then it's Charlie plus in terms of age.
And it's validating what you've done as a designer, what you've shot for, right? So this idea of development and considering what is your market that you're going for, and what do you know about the child and how they develop, not just linguistically, in terms of physical and motor development as well, because this is a physical and motor act. And you just need to read Jackie Marsh and Guy Merchant's work on the actions and the motions that are associated with ebook reading if you want a more deep understanding. I use their framework in the coding.
Jackie Marsh?
And Guy Merchant. I have the PDF, so if you want me, I can email them if there's Wi-Fi access to anybody. So this is Warren's sweet spot, Elizabeth Sulsby. She worked with Bill Thiel in the 80s and developed this idea of emergent literacy, that what we know about language and literacy, our ideas about how language and print work in the world, we start to develop those understandings from birth, from the womb even, onward. That's why parents read stories aloud when they're pregnant, because they hear that storybook language and it becomes familiar. So what we know is when children are reconstructing familiar stories that they've heard, we ask them, read me your story. We do this all the time in kindergarten. We do this all the time in preschool. Read me your story. They're not really reading the story. They're taking what they know about the predictability of the narrative and the use of language and what they're seeing on the page. And they're giving you a reconstruction, a window into what it is that they've picked up along the way. Their understandings about story and books and how they work. So when children are very, very young, they pay attention to the pictures. There's not a cohesive narrative, right? As they get older, you start to see this sort of dialogue between the child and the person who's asking them to tell them their story. And they sort of look at the person asking to tell them the story, and it becomes like a dialogue, and they're looking for validation, and there isn't that much he said, she said, there isn't that much storybook language. About 4 years old, after 3 readings to 5 readings of a familiar story, you start to see written-like language in their reconstructions. Now, think back to the trajectories. At 4 years old, they've developed some initial decoding, they've developed phonological awareness, their articulation and their syntactical structures are pretty well developed. And so it's not by chance that that's when you start to see those behaviors. And these behaviors are fairly stable across samples of kids. As they get older, up into 5, 6, 7, they start to pay attention to the words. What you see when that sort of phonological breakthrough happens is children will say, I don't know how to read that. Because they know that they can't process with fluency, and so they check out. You see the same behavior in children when they cannot access the hotspots, page turn. They check out because cognitively it is a frustrating experience. They cannot do it. There's a bottleneck. And so as those phonics skills and decoding skills mature, then they start to move into traditional decoding. And so in this acclimation stage, we want to keep them situationally interested in the act of reading so that they can start with interest and think of storybook reading as a valuable, validated act. Because a lot of times, at least in the kindergarten, when I was a kindergarten teacher, we had families that storybook reading was not part of their home culture. And that's an incredibly difficult challenge to overcome. To get them situationally interested was very difficult. And I think screens helped, because when we did a sort of Waterford early learning program in my kindergarten classroom, which I was not a terribly big fan of, but the kids that didn't have that storybook reading as part of their culture, guess what? They were always going, when's it my turn? Because the screen serves to situational interest. In the same way that familiar characters often serve to stimulate that interest. Where am I at?
For continuing on, one thing that might be really helpful, Katie, is if you could just right now note the researchers that you're following, who those of us who are also interested in this should be following, right? So who are you reading on, questions of like when narrative starts in young children?
Yeah, give us
Who
a
are the
roadmap
researchers
of-
that we should be really in tune with? You've mentioned Jackie Marsh a couple of times, for sure.
Salsby and Teal did a lot of printed narrative, and I think that translated. Ofra Korat and
Can you make
Dina
a printed
Shamir.
list? These are
Sure.
really
maybe
hard
that would be helpful, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can even make a Google Drive.
And
maybe.
is there, so I know
Key
you've got your
readings.
blog, and, which is awesome, I didn't know about, until recently. Is there a journal that you're going to, I'm just kind of, even maybe for the group here, as we kind of start to kind of crowdsource our knowledge on all of this, there's the Journal on Children and Media that I've gone to sometimes.
So I went to an
Literacy journals.
ebook fully conference on ebook and children's comprehension of ebooks. In Montreal, there's a, at McGill University, there's a blog that's affiliated with them, and they, from there, have 2 special issues of journals that are coming out just on ebooks. So I know of 4 that are coming out in the next, I want to say year, that are just wholeheartedly on ebooks. There's an Early Ed and Development, there's a Journal of Early Childhood Literacy special issue that's coming out, and there is a Frontiers in Developmental Psychology about toddlers and touchscreens that's coming out, and then Journal of Child-Computer Interaction. I totally fudged the name of the journal, but so there's 4 that are coming out in the next.
Katie, would it be really, really dreary for you just to have a note of
No,
this and then give it to Warren?
I'm planning on reflecting on this experience here in a blog post. So,
so you could put it in the blog as well. That would just be so great, I think.
Absolutely. Yep.
There was also Jeremy Bruick spoke here, and he did a talk, and his was very classroom applied. He talked a lot about using these in classroom context. He tried to get here, but got tied up. He sends his regards. But I think that would be great as sort of a crash course in bringing us up to speed quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can do that.
Can we just bash on while we've got
Sure.
some time?
Yeah. So if you look at how reading develops, there's a similar process with writing. And it overlays onto both the development of what is concrete to what is abstract. So in the earliest stages, it's all scribbles, and the text in the image are one. So they don't see these things, the text is abstract and separate from the images. They're all the same thing to a very young learner. And as their decoding and phonological awareness skills develop, they start using more of those skills in their writing. Yeah. So the how do we get children to learn these things is sort of the part of this presentation that I struggled with most. And I'm starting with this idea of moving from concrete to abstract thinking. And in this section, I don't focus purely on ebook apps. I'm focusing on some mixtures of phonological awareness phonics apps as well. And so here are 2 examples of things that I see out there that have tried to master this criticism of the iPad's too abstract. They have taken manipulatives and interacted them with the screen surface to make the process more concrete for children. I don't know the impact. I don't know of any research that has studied the impact of using a tangible tech on screen. And so I can't make a statement about that, but there's a criticism that it's too abstract, and so this is the solution that the tech world has come up with. And again, I referred to the level of abstraction in reading development. You get to dialogue markers and decontextualized language, and they're written like, that is terribly abstract. And so children need that concrete, right, from early on. Part of the conversation about how do we teach children to read is called the Great Debate. And it started something called the Reading Wars about what is the most effective way to teach children how to read. There was the whole language camp where they said, well, we'll just read with children and all of them will learn effectively. This is what happened in California, and it was a abysmal fail by a lot of measures. And then there's the camp that focuses on phonics first, where we teach children letter knowledge and letter sounds. And you know what? They have a lot of convincing evidence. You know why? Because those constructs are really easy to measure. Can a child segment? Can a child blend? Well, yeah, that's really easy to observe. Did a child understand point of view in a narrative? How do you get a 4-year-old to tell you that? It is really, really hard to measure that stuff. And so the history of this great debate sort of hit a pinnacle point with the National Reading Panel. And in UK, I think they did the Rose Report.
Yes.
Correct? And a lot of this evidence finding and synthesis of research is finding, well, this word-first approach is really effective. But not all children can learn about language in a word-first approach. And so you see this pendulum swing from word-first to whole language and back again. And what I think, at least for the past 15, 20 years, has been the talk or the conversation is something that we call a balanced literacy approach. For those of you that are not teachers, that are not child development, early literacy experts, I decided that I would show you how literacy people think about phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. Phonological awareness is the study of sounds in language. And we have sentences, which are multiple words that are made up of smaller units of sounds. The words have sometimes multiple syllables. Inside a syllable, there's always a vowel sound. And we have compound words, and then we have words that are one syllable that have what's called an onset and a rhyme. Does anyone know how to explain the difference between onset and rhyme? Go ahead, Jane.
It's not rhyme like you think R-H-Y-M-E, it's R-I-M-E. And so the onset is the beginning of a word, and the rhyme is the end, which makes sense because the end of words do rhyme. So that's how you remember it.
Families. Right, and it's interesting when I tell my preschool teachers, when we're talking about onset and rhyme, onset is everything up to the first vowel. So it can be a consonant blend, it can be a cluster of sounds. And then the rhyme is everything after that vowel and after.
And what happens if it's a word that begins with a vowel?
Yeah. Then there is no onset.
There's no onset. Okay. It's all rhyme.
Yeah. So word family, does word family cover that, a lot of that?
Yes.
When you're talking about preschool, so
Absolutely.
all the act words, you know,
Yes, absolutely. Within a word or a syllable, you typically have what are called the initial, medial, and final sounds. When we're talking with children, we say beginning, middle, and end sound. There's a scale of skills that falls behind this that move from more complex to less complex, right? And so I've sort of tried to illustrate this as a tool that I use with my people that are in teacher prep courses. We ask children to isolate sounds. So what sound do you hear at the beginning of ball? That's an isolation task, right? And then we ask them to blend. If I say all, that's an onset rhyme blending task. We ask them to segment, where we give them a whole word and chop it up. And then we ask them to manipulate, say box without the ox. Now add at the beginning. That's a manipulation task, right? And these are all skills that, by the research, have demonstrated to be effective to increase children's reading skills. It's important to note, this can happen without any print. You can do this in the dark with your eyes closed, right? You don't need print to practice phonological awareness. The minute you bring print into it, it is no longer phonological awareness, it is phonics, okay? And phonics is what we talk about when we're talking about spelling, essentially, but it's the reverse. Encoding is spelling, and phonics is the decoding. But as you saw with that slide with the developmental trajectories, those lines are highly correlated, and they develop in this way. Emergent is basically preschool. Letter name alphabetic is when they can tell you like the beginning sound of a word. So I went to the store might be the letter I, the letter W, the number 2, and the letter S. Right? Letter name alphabetic. After that, they start using what they know about word families within word patterns to compose and to decode text. That typically happens at first grade level. Then you start talking about syllables and affixes and how do you break words down to decode and encode meaning there. Up about 11 years old, they start to talk about derivational spellings. Now, I have a very dear friend who teaches at a progressive school in California. They don't teach intentionally any of those first 3 stages in kindergarten. They teach meaning-based spelling. So they do morphemic analysis. They're looking at the word exit in text. They're developing theories about what the EX uses as a meaning of, a unit of meaning. which is a very different way, I think, of approaching how do we decode text than a phonics first approach. So some of the things that I think that I observe in the app world is that sometimes people that do these phonics apps don't call it the right thing. Sometimes. Yes.
Oh, man.
So Phonics Fun 4, it's a free app, right? They say drag the correct rhyme to the following picture. Well, they don't drag OX. They drag the letter X. That's the final sound. That is not the rhyme. Right? Huge. The other thing, and this is sort of that's a criticism. This is a compliment. When they put the words that they're learning and working with in context, there are a lot of studies that show that words in context are more important to children, that they retain that information better when it's in context, which is part of the reason why Endless Reader and Endless ABCs are so effective, and why they are able to get away with the hideous price points. I think it's like $45 to buy the bundle of words across levels. The other thing that I find really interesting to consider is the idea of rapid and automatic naming. Do you guys know what that is? So how quickly can children name things? And then the reverse of that.
Naming.
Yeah. And the reverse of that is how quickly can they process the things that the visual stimuli that they're seeing, right? So here's Peapod Lab's ABC House. First picture. At the top appears, at the top are white words. That basically the cards are thrown down very quickly, and the word, it flips very quickly with it. And then the child is asked to identify the printed word that they saw for maybe a split second, which I understand the purpose is to look at the sounds of the words. But in terms of children needing a model sometimes, that quick rollover of text at the top is not an effective strategy.
I mean, flashcards.
Well, yeah.
Rapid flashcards.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that's interesting in the design of these things, and as teachers, we sort of know that, book and bed, those are both start with the same sound. So that is a more complex task than to do book and moon, right? Because they start with the same letter.
And that's an image of a bunch of books, not just a book. So it's gonna throw some kids off.
Right.
I thought it was a bed cover with a bed written book.
But this is the start screen. This is the start screen. So this is what they start with. Their first one that I experienced, and I'm sure there's some randomness behind the programming, but the first one that they start with out the gate are two things that start with the same sound. And we know that children developmentally start at that initial sound.
Yeah, initial sound, yeah.
And that they don't read through to the end of the word oftentimes. So, things to think about. We also know that children struggle with physical orientation of objects. The second one that they have to have on this one is bed and door. B and D, you flip them around and they're the same letter. They're made up of the same parts. So, visually hard for children. This is more easy, right? And then there's this Doc McStuffins app, which they say the words, and then what happens, let me see if I have it up and ready. So these are like the practice ones where there aren't that many choices, right? And pedagogically it makes sense. You limit the number of choices that children have to make an action easier to do. So it has some bit of feedback in it.
You get it wrong. You get it wrong.
Yeah.
Are you ready to keep playing
Yes,
in
I'm
the
ready.
snow?
Chip. So they only allow this one. They're training you on the action, and not giving you. So here's where you have a choice, right? So if I bring Clip over to the crate,
We've just got to keep trying.
but there is no feedback there, right? they don't say listen to the beginning sound of the word clip, which is what I would say if I was a teacher.
If you touch the pictures, does it say what they are? The pictures?
Yeah. Crate.
Okay, because
That looks like a box to me.
Right. And the other thing that doesn't happen is the sounds are not on the letters, right? So for me, there's so much more room for development in here. Now, if I were a teacher, I could just integrate that into my classroom, unless it's a away from teacher activity, which how many of you guys would use this as away from teacher activity, right? Absolutely. And so the kids that struggle at age level, appropriate phonological tasks are not getting the feedback that they need. And so the whole argument of, oh, this can provide great scaffolding and support away from teacher, not necessarily the
You also
case.
have the Lawrence Welk band playing in the background that you can't turn off. And the font on the things is really small. And
Glow. Chew.
Yeah, the font is bothersome.
Yeah.
It's small,
Right.
and it's a triple outline.
yeah, and they also clutter, it's all very cluttered.
To hear each word.
They-
Chew.
So it's telling you what you can do, a strategy to hear the words again, but it's not helping you determine what this word is
You've
again.
forgotten that.
I've forgotten it. I'm an English language learner. I don't know what they told me this was.
Well, it doesn't, you don't know what glow
Yeah,
is.
that's right. That's where I'm at.
Is there an issue about the fact that some people would object to if the characters then, the letters being given sounds, not names? Because if they're seen individually in the UK, we have a whole thing about the fact that you can't say G, because if it's the beginning of giraffe, for example,
It's a
then
J.
it's not G.
Right.
So they would. So as soon as you start isolating letters, then we're taught. I think. I mean, I'm not a teacher, but you use the letter name. I remember the school when my kids were little. They were very hot on using the letter names, not saying abacada, but ABCD. So I wonder if that's a reason that they haven't.
No, they don't,
They just didn't think of it.
No, they're just, to me, that's not sound educational practice, what they're doing there.
I just wondered if that was an issue for you, that question of naming letters first.
I mean, Montessori is much different than, let's say, if you went into, a basic Wilson program or Houghton Mifflin or something. They all have different, but pretty much everything says that you have to be sequential and you have to be systematic and you.
And I want to say, this is still better than 90% of the apps
Still
out
better
there.
than Products 1.4.
And another argument would say that children will take something from all of this. and that
Absolutely.
They're not going to die. It's not like all this knowledge will be sucked out of their brain the second they see this poorly designed experience. But it all fits in, and they're more likely to hit the home button.
Exactly.
You were saying that your children really enjoyed this.
My Annie likes this because Dr. McStuffins is in her top 5, for sure.
What I was going to say too, as app developers of educational games ourselves, you often have to make a trade-off between, because in our philosophy, everything falls apart if the app's not fun, right? There's no point in trying to teach if the app's not fun. And so there are often things, it's a constant point that we get to between trying to teach and making it fun, and sometimes the two don't go together. And so you have to have trade-offs. I'm not saying that this is the case in this one, but we have to make trade-offs in certain...
I entirely understand that this is a intertangled web that
Yeah.
we're trying to figure out here. What I was saying about processing speed and visual recognition, look at how quickly these things flip over. That's too fast. It is way too fast. And so for a kid that doesn't know that this isn't faucet or sink drip, to try to match that is...
But that just says to me that they haven't tested it.
So when I get it wrong a couple of times here, it will flip that word over and leave it there, which I like. But there's this assumption that this is within the skill set, the visual recognition and memory, putting it into a memory slot and recalling it is there.
But Pierre Abel of Las Caballo would have a control panel on the side and would let you control the speed. He would give you the ability and actually let the child
determine,
increase the length, and change it between upper and lowercase, these are all great options.
We do that for length of time that you allow the child to
Yes,
read it
exactly.
yourself. You want a short, medium, or long term. It didn't work to have specific numbers of seconds, but we made judgments about giving children the option, because some children were finding that decoding harder.
I think that this whole idea of part of the process is that you have to have practice, but you have to have space for kids to construct their own meanings. And one of the features that I am most fond of in ebook apps is this allowing children to record their own narration feature. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that. This app was a book, and they changed it into an app. And Press Here allows children to construct their own meaning on a variety of games that are totally non-directional. They don't tell the child how to interact with it, which I think is very interesting. And a lot of people in my sphere of people that I discuss apps with, that I don't like that app. It's too open-ended. But me, I kind of like it because there's so much conversation that you can have kids about what they're understanding. So for example, this idea of rain. Press Here, you do things with the dots, and the dots move or change colors. So the idea of rain is that the drops come down from the top of the screen, and the children can click and make them stationary, which kind of goes against the laws of gravity.
Yes.
Right, exactly. So you can build structures to contain the rain in here. I've had conversations with my 7-year-old about gravity and about water and viscosity of fluid and how it fills and goes down to an empty space. And we've compared it with puddles. Take a screenshot of this and put it into an ebook app, or send it home with a snippet of language, and that the potential for that instructionally is huge. And I think
it's also really interesting that Press Here is not a narrative book. I mean, it's a very free. In some ways, it's a very free book. It's about exploring the idea of a book and the idea of what language does and the idea of what illustration does. And so I think it's one that lends itself particularly well to that sort of evolution into a different medium.
This is from Doug Clark. He's a game designer, a serious game designer. And he said that asking whether games, and I would insert the word media there, interactive media, are good for learning is not the right question. It's a bad question to ask, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. The design of the learning environment that is part of this circle is what matters, right? So we can have any kind of media, but if you're not paying attention to the child who's using it, in the activity and the socio-cultural context in which you're using it, kind of doesn't matter. And so I think if you walk away with anything, it's that you have to consider more than just the text. You have to consider more than just the child. It is a dynamic circle, and I wish I had gears, Warren, because then it would really be synergistic and all make sense. So there you have it.